Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Art, as always, for turning our minds toward God with your music. It's a real service. It always reminds me of the prophecy in Matthew 24, where Jesus says, at the end time, right up till the day he returns, there will be people marrying and given in marriage. And I always picture Mr. Blakey singing at the weddings, because he just goes on forever and hits the high notes. And my high notes left a long time ago, so I appreciate Mr. Blakey. Hello, my name is Mark Graham. I'm on my second 40 years, and I still throw knuckleballs. 4th of July is one of my favorite holidays, and it's been one of the safe holidays for church people, you know. There's other days that I won't even mention that we avoid at all costs, but 4th of July has traditionally been one of those safe ones where we can take part and we can enjoy it. I love red, white, and blue. It's not natural at all. You know, it doesn't appear too much, but red, white, and blue is a very striking, beautiful combination. And on 4th of July, we bring out the bunting and the banners and fly our flags. But you know, this year, 4th of July, and maybe the last few, have been a little different. Still happiness. I never pass up a chance for free fireworks, so I went and saw them in Berea. But it's a little different anymore, isn't it? I take the pulse of my friends on Facebook and other places, and people were saying things, people whom I really respect, people who I know are patriots and very happy to be Americans, but people were saying it's a little different this year. I just don't feel quite as much like celebrating the United States of America because life has changed. There's a lot of stagnation in our country and our government. There's division that we haven't seen as much before. It may have been there, but it wasn't expressed as much. And it's different times to be alive. I don't think it's so much that the country has changed or the blessings have changed, but people have changed. You know, just like Paul said, that people will be different in the last times and that the things that they have suppressed for a long time will come to the fore, and it'll be harder to live with people. We still want to make America great. I don't know if any of you are even aware that I went to a MAGA conference a year ago, MAGA. It was in the Poconos. People wore hats that said, "Make accordions great again." It was the Northeast Squeeze-In, which no doubt you've heard of. It was quite an event, but we had merch, let me tell you. But you know, in general, the country we're at unrest and we're unsettled, and I think we feel that as church people. We may have our gardens and we may do our best to keep our lives as on course and on keel and as beautiful as possible, but we feel different these days. And I've never at any time in the first 40 years or the second 40 years been at a point where I think things are a little different. You know, at some point, I remember my mother in 1967 when she was expecting a brother of mine who was 14 years younger than I am, and saying, I don't think I can bring a child into this world. 1967, you know, seems pretty tame compared to today. But I still like to fill my own life and maybe some other people's with hope because, you know, life goes on for people. The circumstances may have changed, but we have people graduating from high school. We have people starting their lives. We have people buying houses. We have people building houses. We have people having babies. We have people giving in marriage and marrying. We have all kinds of things going on. And how do you cope? How do you cope with that kind of thing? Well, as I get along in years, and it's nice that I can be an example to Mr. Thomas. I always, you know, I know I'm supposed to say that every time I open the Bible, I learn something new, something I've never seen before, and I do. And, you know, the Bible is such a big book that you can't help it. There's always things that either you never knew or you're going to forget and learn again, but at the same time, I kind of know the basics. I feel bad saying that because I'm supposed to say, every time I open the Bible, I just learn so much, and I don't always. Sometimes it's something I've read before, and I appreciate it, but I pretty much know the basics. As Jim said, life goes by very quickly. God gives us pretty much a short time to the consternation of the angels who have had practically an eternity to make decisions. And one of the reasons they object to human beings is that we're worms and we have such a short time to choose whether to live God's way or not. But by the time I've been in the church 50 years, and that's short compared to some of the people here. There's many people in our church today who've been around that long or longer. And I pretty much know the basics. So I find myself turning to other things, like reading situations in the Bible and thinking about how it would have been to be in a situation like that. What was it like to be alive in the day of Moses, or to experience some of the things that Jesus' disciples experienced in person with him in the room or next to them? And one of the things that I often think about in these troubled times is how similar they are and how well they compare with the time in history when Jesus Christ was alive on earth as a human being. There are various epic events as we move through the history of God's people. Some of them stand out, of course, as you know. Recreation of the earth is a fairly major one in 7 days, and the creation of Adam and Eve. The next biggie would have been Noah and the flood. You all know that story. And then the Exodus that Jim talked about, Moses. And then the kingdom of Israel, David and Solomon, and building of the temple. And then the nation going into captivity. And then the return, which is one of the major miracles of history, that happened, that a ruler in the world said, I'm sending those people back to Jerusalem. It made no sense at the time. It makes very little sense today, except that God had something going on. And I find that very inspiring to read those stories. And they're documented. 2 complete books of the Bible are about that time. And you could say that the book of Esther is too, in a way. Then, of course, after the return to Jerusalem, were the events that led up to the nation of Israel being around again in the time when Jesus was born as a man. And then after that, from the first century till now, as far as the history of God's people, we have a pretty big gap there. You could say that God was laying the foundation. One of the important things about the rise of the United States, whether you want to argue that it was founded as a godly nation or not, and there's arguments both ways, but one of the things about it is that it enabled a work to be done in the world. And we really were a nation without parallel after World War II. And it's so peculiar that our nation arose to that prominence that you have to think that God was behind it. Whether you look at it, you can do your best to prove that we're descendants of Abraham, but you can also leave all that behind and just look at world history. And look at what the United States did. The United States really created the Europe of today. They created the Japan of today. You could say that the British Commonwealth created many of the other nations today, whether they're English-speaking people or not. We had a huge effect. And things have changed now. We're not that nation that we used to be, but it did happen, and it set up the ability to have the amazing technology and accomplishments that we have today, and the relative wealth of our country that enabled a gospel to be preached. Now the game has changed, but the internet has changed that game too quite a bit. And so we're in a time right now, whether we realize it or not, that is a major event in the history of God's people. We're living through it, and we don't see dramatic things happening necessarily in our own lives. So I wonder if we tend to ignore it or make it smaller than it really is. But things are happening. And of course, the next big event will be the return of Jesus Christ. So I want to compare the time that we're living in now with the time when Jesus lived on earth and why there are certain similarities. They're different times, there's no question about it. But there's certain parallels that to me are very clear. One was that when Jesus was born, it was clear in most people's minds that something was about to happen, something big. You know from reading the book of Daniel that in Daniel 9, he receives a vision from the angel Gabriel. And in this vision, he's given a prophecy of 70 weeks. You can read about it in Daniel 9. You can read the details in our church literature. I don't want to take the time to go through all the things that the book of Daniel predicts, because there's historical fulfillment of many of them, but there's also room for debate on exactly how things were fulfilled. But when you combine that with a prophecy in Jeremiah 29 and verse 10, that Daniel even quotes. It's the reason Daniel goes before God and starts asking questions, because he has Jeremiah's prophecy in mind. And you end up with a 70 weeks prophecy. Well, as I said, it can be interpreted many different ways, but there are reasons to think that it talks about the rise of something right about the time that Jesus Christ was born. And people were primed for that kind of thing. Remember when men from the east came to Herod and said, something significant has happened and a person has been born. Herod didn't say, that's nuts. Herod panicked because he knew that the times were ripe for that kind of thing. Also, just politically, things were ripe for a kind of change. There was, the Maccabees had reestablished the temple in their own limited revolt against the Roman Empire and the Greek dynasties and things, and the temple had been rebuilt. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with the current government, and people were trying to find ways to function as God's people and still stay inside that. There were events around Jesus' birth, and yes, they weren't very widely known, but remember that when Jesus was alive, when he was in his 30s doing the ministry, the men who were out in the field and had heard angels sing and had gone into Bethlehem to see the new baby, they were alive still, and they were telling stories to somebody. And remember that they were babies put to death. It's a terrible, terrible thing, but it's something that people would have remembered. Oh yes, that was the year that Herod did that. And they were all tied in, but people were wondering what was going to happen. Well, our times are the same way. We know that something is on edge, and because we look at things through the filter of God's word, we have a little more clue about things than we might otherwise. If you turn to the chapter of Matthew 24, how many of you were part of the organization called the Worldwide Church of God, or ever attended services there? All right, now keep your hands up and look around, people. Look around. It's a lot of hands up in the air. You can put them down. Thank you. I know we're all getting older. You can put your hands down now. But back then, you know what I'm talking about when I say that if there was one chapter that figured in our writings and in our understanding of things, it was Matthew 24. Many of us were called because of the things that became clear to us out of the chapter Matthew 24. And this chapter is echoed in the book of Luke and also in the book of Mark, but most of it is most clearly expounded in the book of Matthew. And among the things that it says in verse 21 of chapter 24, and the whole chapter and 25, this whole message that Jesus gives here, is worth reading and keeping in your minds, because I think there's things that we forget that we're still told to pray about and remember. But in verse 21, it says, "For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, these days will be shortened." In other words, things can end. There's going to reach a time when the world can end. Now, I know I said that I'm trying to give you hope, but how many of you remember crouching under your desks for nuclear bomb tests? I do. What's the right word? Not nuclear bomb tests. We didn't do those in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. But shelter, nuclear, in case of nuclear war, we practiced in our schools sheltering. That leads to crazy people. And in some cases, it has actually. We think that terrifying things in our schools are a relatively new thing, but I remember those days, and it was very clear that for the first time in history, we could not only destroy people, but we could destroy pretty much everything on the earth. And it says, and according to Jesus' own prophecy that came from 2,000 years ago, that is a sign of his second coming. That when the world can end, that's a clue. And you remember in verse 14, and Matthew 24:14 is one of the central verses that we all memorized in those days and took very much to heart, and is still in our hearts. But it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Well, the end hasn't come, which makes you think that there's still more gospel preaching to be done, and that's what we have devoted our lives to. But my only point in this is that there are similarities now, that we know things are going to happen. One of the most incredible verses is at the end of the book of Daniel, and this is just thrown in passing. You all are aware of this, but in Daniel 12, again, Daniel is being given a vision, and at the end of this vision, in Daniel 12 and verse 4, the angel says to him, "But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end." In other words, we're done. But he's not done, because he throws in one more sentence, and he says, "Oh, by the way, many will go here and there, and knowledge will increase." Well, if you were alive in 1970, you might have thought, we have airplanes, we have television, we have newspapers. Knowledge has increased, and many travel to and fro. But you hadn't seen anything yet. And in that short time, it's incredible what has happened as far as knowledge. I mean, you can fact check my sermon with your phone sitting right there. Unfortunately, the Wi-Fi password is in the bulletin. And you can text me about my errors as I'm standing here speaking, which is called cyber heckling. Please. I don't have my phone on, so I'm semi-immune to this, but it can be done. It's just incredible, the amount of knowledge. And talk about traveling to and fro. Well, it used to be that, fly to Italy for the feast. But now it's, I think I'll go to the planet Saturn for the feast this year. Well, of course, that's not going to happen right now. But we're very casual about our traveling. Even though, we complain about lost luggage and things like that, the fact is that we can get halfway around the world in a day or even farther. It can be done. It's just incredible. I would never have dreamed before I was in God's church that I would end up in Australia. And that's just one trip that I've taken. Many of you have taken many more trips and met many more people. And it's just incredible. I don't know if any of you remember Jack Davies from the Worldwide Congregation, Cleveland East. But I remember one time he gave us a tour of NASA. I think it was maybe the men's club, and the men and women he was showing us things at NASA, and it was in probably the early 80s, and Jack was trying to communicate something to us, and I didn't realize till later he was trying to tell us about the internet. He was trying to tell us about how connected we would be, and he said, yes, when Jesus Christ returns and the whole world sees him, this is the way it will happen, because everyone will have this technology, and we're all, "Oh, sure, yeah, that sure was a good supper we had. Yeah." And Jack was trying to tell us about that. I still remember that. And NASA, of course, played a role in that kind of thing. So just as in Jesus' day, now it is clear in many people's minds, particularly God's people, that we are in the end times and that something is about to happen. Another thing that was true of Jesus' time, and I don't want to belabor this for our time, but it's just an interesting historical fact that the existing people of God at the time were just trying to get through to life, and as far as like a coming kingdom or preaching God's way of life or things like that, they weren't able to do it very well because they were impotent due to divisions in their own religious bodies and a desire to preserve the status quo, which is a very, very strong desire in all of us. All I really want to do is garden in Berea, Ohio, and people leave me alone. My tomatoes are turning red. I'm excited about this. I don't really want to know about whether the bill will pass the Senate that just passed in the House, they don't exist when I'm doing my garden. I want to preserve the status quo. Yes, I say I want Jesus to return, and I do want him to bring his kingdom as long as it just doesn't cause me too much trouble, and interfere with my green beans, then we're okay. But that's just such a strong human desire. And there were many groups in Jesus' day. We think of the Pharisees and we think of the Sadducees, but there were more than that. And Jesus found ways to tweak them and to use their idiosyncrasies to his benefit. The Pharisees were descended from, or they had their origins in the Maccabean freedom fighters of the century before. They were generally middle-class people. They generally were merchant class. They saw the entire Old Testament as law and something that they had to obey, and they believed very much in the oral interpretation over the centuries that their own teachers had taught them. It was very important. They believed in a bodily resurrection after death at some point, and they were very much in favor and present in the synagogue system. In the synagogues, the local congregations, the Pharisees pretty much ran that kind of thing. They accepted the Roman rule as a necessary evil. This was different from the Sadducees. The Sadducees, the very word, the consonants in it, Sadducees, comes from Zadok. Zadok was the high priest in Solomon's time. And the Sadducees said that Zadok descendants were the only people who could be priests at that point. They very much believed it. They tended to be the wealthy people. They were aristocratic. They were often Hellenistic, which means they fit in with the culture of the world in that day. Many of them were priests. They accepted only the Torah as their law, and the temple was the only path to God. And the temple was paramount to them as opposed to the synagogues. The temple, the central place for worship. They also didn't believe in a bodily resurrection, and this becomes important. For one thing, it shows that they weren't really looking to the future, that they believed in life now, and that any plans God had for the future, bringing a kingdom and changing the earth, were of no concern to them. They liked the way things were. Then there was a group called the Essenes, and you're familiar with people like that today. They also believed very much in the supremacy of Zadok priests, but they wanted to withdraw from corruption. They were people who believed very much in backyard gardening, except they did it out in the wilderness. They were preparing for the imminent arrival of the kingdom. They were the survivalists. And one of the things that the Essenes did for us is they preserved scriptures as part of this survivalism in ways that other people didn't, and they hid them. And so some of the synagogue scriptures have deteriorated, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are Essene scriptures, some of the ones that we have today. So we owe a little bit to them. They had their isolated communities away from the centers of civilization. They believed in cleansing and communal meals and communal property. There was also a group called the Zealots, and this was sort of a catch-all thing, the crazies. I won't mention any names, but think of a Church of God group who you think of, and your immediate reaction is, but they're nuts. And there are some groups like that, certainly not us. But there are groups like that, and you can come up with them on your own, and they get nuttier and nuttier. Well, these would have fallen under the realm of zealots. And remember Jesus had a reference to somebody called Judas the Galilean, and he raised an uprising. These people would stage, the equivalent of mass shootings. They would kill people. They would sabotage things that the Romans were doing. Some of them came out of the Pharisee group, and some of them were religious Jews mostly from the region of Galilee. They were the resistors, and they hated Roman rule, and yet they believed in God. As I said, they carried out terrorism against the Romans. And these people were all mixed together. There were many other groups also that fit under that category of zealots. But you remember that one of the apostles was named Simon the Zealot. Jesus Christ called him. He's probably, of the 12, the one that we know the least about. And the only thing that the Bible definitely nails him on is he was a zealot, meaning he was from one of those crazy churches. And yet somehow he fit in with Jesus' program and became a supporter of Jesus, came out of that, and became part of Jesus' own ministry at that point. Simon the Zealot is mentioned in Matthew 10 and Mark 3. And of course, it's to distinguish him from another Simon who was a little more famous and a little more outspoken, the man who we know as Simon Peter. Paul, you might recall in Acts 23, used the Sadducees, used these divisions to the benefit not only of him, but of preaching the gospel, where he was taken captive, and he said, well, I plead my case because I'm innocent, and I'm only being persecuted because I believe in the resurrection of the body. That's in Acts 23. Well, what happened was the people who believed in resurrection at that point are going, yes. And the other people are going, wait a minute, that's not the way that this works. And so they started arguing with themselves. It's a fine story in Acts 23 and verse 6, but it couldn't have happened without those divisions. Well, what do we see today? And again, I don't want to belabor this because we're doing what we can. We're trying to be in harmony with all of God's people. I remember when I was first coming into the church out in Montana, I met a man out in the woods. He was a logger, and I was working for the Forest Service, and it turned out he was a Sabbath keeper. I have no idea how that came up. It doesn't often come up in casual conversation, like, hi, how are you? Nice day. Do you keep the Sabbath? But it turned out he did. And I didn't hug him, but I wanted to, because there I was out in the middle of the wilderness, and here was a Sabbath keeper. And if he was a Sabbath keeper, he was my brother. Today I would say, well, how do you keep the Sabbath? Do you keep it the right way? Do you keep it the way that I do? And then we could argue about it. And that kind of thing, as with all human endeavors, has led to us splitting up into different groups. I, in my own crazy zealousness, went to the Troyer's Hollow campout a few weeks ago. Every time I go, I say, I think I'm done camping. And then a few years later, I go again. So I can't predict how that cycle will play out. But there were many people there. There were people from different groups. It was very refreshing to see. But there was also some sadness there, because I was sitting next to a man. Were any of you there? There were so many babies there. I don't know what's happened. Well, I do know what's happening in the Church of God to cause that, but I mean, I don't. There's a lot of babies. Let's just say that, and it was incredible. Did you ever see 101 Dalmatians, where they have the midnight bark, where the dogs would communicate over London? Well, that's the way it was at night at Troyer's Hollow. One baby would start up on the west end, and then another baby would start up in the next end, and it would echo through the valley. But it was really nice to hear. I didn't mind at all, because number one, I didn't have to get up and take care of the baby at that point. But it was also just very refreshing to know that life goes on, because having a baby is one of the most optimistic things that human beings have ever done and still do. So I liked it. But as I said, the man I was sitting next to, he really wasn't talking about it, but two of his children were there with their babies and with their spouses, and contributing quite a bit. But he had a third child, and the third child was part of a group, had married into part of a group that wasn't allowed to be there. And I thought, what have we done to ourselves, to do that kind of thing? I notice it in my own very strange perspective, which is that, as many of you know, I've written hymns for the churches of God. And it's one of the few things that seem to cross organizational boundaries. And one of the things I can tell you is, if a person comes up to me and says they like such and such a hymn, I can often say, oh, well, you must be part of this group, or you must be part of this group, because there are different hymns in the different hymn books. And it's very strange to me. There's hymns that I've written that I've never heard a congregation sing, but that I got an email yesterday thanking me for a certain hymn that they really liked and that they were promoting at their camp. And it's a hymn that I've never heard, because it's not in our hymnal. I've heard it at home a lot, but not here. So it's interesting to me. When we were in the old days, I had mentioned Worldwide Church of God, we were kind of the only game in town. It wasn't 100% true. But now it's different, and now we wonder what kinds of things can happen to bring us together again. And some things do happen, and I admire that spirit in people, that they don't want to be it. But just as there were divisions then, there are divisions now, and the sadness is that they render our efforts impotent sometimes, and that we could accomplish so much more if we were doing it as a cohesive single group. And sometimes I get frustrated about that. I happen to like where I am. I mean, I know that when we speak like this, it gets recorded and it's public, and I'm very happy to be part of United Church of God, because they let me worship God, and they pretty much leave me alone, and I try to be with the program and support it, and I admire the things that they're doing. I even admire the way that they run things, so I'm not unhappy about that. But at the same time, there's an underlying sadness that we're split at all, And so that is a similarity to those times. Also, in the time of Jesus living on earth, something new arose from an unforeseen direction. There was a clog in the works at that point because of the way that God's people were at that point. And do you remember the story of the Gordian knot, where I don't remember what philosopher it was, but there was a knot tied by a man named Gordia, and it was the Gordian knot, and nobody could untie it, and it was prophesied, I know who it was, I just remembered. It was prophesied that whoever could untie this knot would conquer the world. Do you remember who it was? Alexander the Great came in, and he didn't bother to untie it. He looked at the knot, and in an Indiana Jones move, he picked up his sword and just cut through the knot, and the knot was undone at that point. So the word must have been undone, not untied, on a technicality. He did go on to conquer the world, just as a little aside. But that's kind of what happened, was in a direction no one expected, a man stood up in the wilderness. And he wasn't the Messiah, and he was very clear that he wasn't the Messiah. And people thought he was a little odd, and he dressed funny, and he had kind of a fad diet, and it didn't sound very appetizing to other people, but it seemed to work for him. And people went out from all the different groups in the wilderness to see John the Baptist. And it had been predicted that this man would arise, but people were not expecting it that way. They were expecting someone to stand up in the temple, not down by the River Jordan. And that's why Jesus said, well, what did you do? Go out to see the scenery? Did you go out to see how the reeds blow in the wind? He said, no, you got a message, and it's zeroed into your mind in a place where it could weasel in, and you couldn't stop thinking about it, and you had to go out and see what he was doing. And of course, he set up Jesus' ministry at that. Jesus was criticized for hanging with the wrong people. That wasn't the way people were supposed to do it. He hung out with sinners, and he then said in the face of the people who challenged him, well, it's the sick who need a doctor, isn't it? He challenged the authorities who had been given legal rule by the Romans. By the end of his life, he had annoyed every identifiable ruling class, and that's why his life ended in Jewish society. They opposed him. The scribes, I can give you scriptures if you want. The scribes, read Mark 2 and verses 6 to 7. Then he picked on the teachers of the law in Mark 12 and verse 38. He picked on the priests in Mark 14 and verse 55, and the Pharisees in Mark 2 and verse 16. And when you start off by saying, woe unto you, don't be like the Pharisees, that's sort of a clue. I mean, he's saying we have to do things differently. And if Jesus, and this is a quote from Craig Greenfield in a book called Subversive Jesus, and he said, if Jesus was simply a nice guy, in other words, a Jewish Joel Osteen, teaching people to love each other, it's hard to see why he was such a threat to the establishment. And as you know, that's one of the reasons that he was killed. He was a threat to the status quo at that point. Well, this is where I get my hope, because something will arise. We know that specific things have to happen between now and the day Jesus Christ returns, and I have a prayer regarding that, and I pray it every day. And I wonder if you might do too. There's something in the Bible that we refer to as the unpardonable sin. And of course, it's a terribly depressing thing to think about, that there are things you can do from which you cannot be redeemed. But I think of the unpardonable sin, and let's turn to Matthew 12 and verses 30, starting in verse 30. Matthew 12, and I actually get hope from this. Because, let's see, Matthew 12 and verse 30, Jesus says, he who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. That's pretty clear. He says, and I tell you, every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven men, but the blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. And he goes on to make it clear, anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but anyone who speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. Well, that's pretty clear, and it's pretty sobering. But at the same time, I think of it as when God's Holy Spirit works, I pray that God will open my eyes to see the right thing, whether it comes out of left field from a place that I've never been expecting, or whether it comes from right next door. And that would be even more jarring because, You don't know my next door neighbor, but I would be very surprised if he was the messenger who would deliver all this. But at the same time, God does what God does. And when it arises out of left field, throwing knuckleballs, I pray that I could, that was a mixed metaphor at best, I pray that I could recognize God's work. And I don't think of it in terms of the unpardonable sin. I think I wish to support it. Even if it seems crazy at the beginning, please open my eyes. And as I said, I pray for that every day. And it keeps me looking forward to when that has to arise, because we know that a house has to be built. We know there's a work done by two prominent people, and that all kinds of things have to happen to build a house for Jesus Christ to return to, and then the real stuff starts. And I just pray that I can understand that. So just as something new arose from an unforeseen direction back then, it has to happen now. And fourth and last, the group was accused in those days of turning the world upside down. And do you know where that started? It started with a nice teenage girl. Let's turn to Luke chapter 1. And this nice teenage girl, who we know was raised as someone who kept God's law, she was a good person, she was a righteous person. And what does she say? Oh, by the way, her name was Mary, and she gave birth to our Savior. She says in Luke 1, and we'll just jump, the whole song is beautiful, and it is a song. In verse 52, she's talking about the mighty one who this is hard for her because she's talking about someone in heaven, and she's also talking about someone whom she will actually bathe and teach him how to tie a shoe and things like that in the time to come. Verse 52, he has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich empty away. And so in those two verses, she has managed to challenge the Roman authorities and rich people, and that's a bad combination. We think Mary lived a ripe old life, so she must have learned to keep her words under control at some point. But as you know, in Acts 17 and verse 6, the way, God's way of life, was described very offhandedly, casually, as, oh yeah, the group of people who want to turn the world upside down. And that's what they want to do. Jesus, overturned tables in the temple. He wasn't out just to make friends at that point. He was sent a very clear message, and yet at the same time, he consistently emphasized nonviolence. Now, this is the Messiah who's going to come back with robes soaked in blood. So it's a message that you have to learn how to understand. But at the time when other people were making the most of themselves and trying to preserve the status quo and to keep their own riches and their own positions, remember that he's the man who rode in on a donkey. He could have ridden in on anything he wanted to, and he chose a donkey basically so that he looked like a fool. John, who had his own perspective on things, and there's things you read in the book of John that you just don't appear in the other three Gospels, in chapter 11, in verse 45, after Jesus had raised Lazarus, the crowds were whipped up to a fury. They really were believing that this man could do anything. And so, starting in verse 45, there was a plot to kill Jesus based on the fact that he was destroying the continuity of their own way of life. The fabric of their life was being changed by this man, and they wanted to do away with him. Verse 45, therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen Mary, this is Mary of Mary and Martha, and had seen what Jesus did, put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. And as Jesus said, aren't you even slightly impressed by the miracles, by the things I've done? No, they're mad because Jesus is getting more attention than they are. If we let him go on like this, everyone will be healed and everyone will be fed no, they don't say that. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take both our place and our nation. So they take the blame off themselves and say, we can't have this man because he's upsetting the Romans. When really, of course, it was themselves. Well, I would just like to point out that notwithstanding the reference to the Bill of Rights in our services today, that you people are dangerous subversives. You don't actually believe in democracy. You don't. When you were baptized, you committed yourselves to a benevolent monarchy. You did. And you can support democracies right now, as I do, and I keep the 4th of July, and I'm very glad to live in America, and I do the best that I can to support our government and our way of life. But at the same time, I believe that the Constitution, as wonderful as it is a temporary document, and in the world tomorrow, it'll be a curiosity. It'll be one more attempt of man to do things right when that in the end didn't work. You people, I have seen the list, and I happen to know that many of you people are signed up for a gathering in October. And when you go to this gathering, you're going to praise an alien coming to earth who is going to destroy every government and set up his own government, and you sing, oh, well, it'll be really good. And of course it will be. It'll be the coming kingdom of God. But you people are going to a subversive gathering in October. I don't know if you've thought of it that way. You're here to undermine what's the status quo. You want changes. Don't deny it. I happen to know, it's the way you are. And yes, this is being recorded. I believe in supporting the government of the United States of America and the president and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and motherhood and all kinds of things. But at the same time, you signed up for that, and I don't want you to forget it. You look at the world and you think it's falling apart. What a terrible world, and it is. And I don't want to take that away. And the evils that are happening in society are evil. But you've been praying for years. In some cases, like Betty right back there, who looks so innocent and so nice, Betty has been praying for way more than 50 years that the kingdom of God would come and replace the governments on earth. Like I said, she looks nice, but she's a dangerous woman. And these things that are happening are things that you have prayed for. The world is finally changing, and we're upset because it affects our gas budget. Well, it's not happiness, and God didn't promise happiness on the road to that. But just to remind you that things are happening, and they're things you prayed for, and they're not all bad things. One of the things that really warms my heart, and one of the reasons it warms my heart, is I don't really understand how it's going to happen. But there's certain verses. Let's turn to the last verses in the Old Testament, in the book of Malachi. Right before you turn the page and Matthew starts with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, born on earth. In the book of Malachi chapter 4, in verse 4, it's talking about the end time, not the end time before Jesus Christ is a man, but the end time now. And the message is, remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws which I gave him at Horeb for all Israel. So that will never change. I can make fun of us being a subversive work, but we will always keep laws. We will always keep God's laws. But then in verse 5, see, I send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with a curse. And that's very powerful words. We have a hymn about it. Turning the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. But I ask you, how did Elijah do that? Nowhere in Elijah's ministry is it like that. He's out taunting priests. He's out criticizing kings and queens. He's out, making grain and oil last forever. He's doing things like that. But nowhere, I always thought of Elijah as an angry, rough man. And yet in his heart, what he wanted to do, according to this, was turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. What is that? I think I understand it, but I don't get backed up by Elijah's ministry, and yet it was definitely part of it. And then in Luke 1, right before Mary's song, an angel has appeared to ancient Zechariah, who became the father of John the Baptist. And in Luke 1:17, the angel happens to mention that your wife is going to have this baby. And he says, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make a people prepared for the Lord. And of course that happened. Jesus Christ in Matthew 17. Let's turn there. In Matthew 17, Jesus said that definitely happened, because this is after what we call the Transfiguration, where they went up on the mountain and Jesus was changed and his disciples saw it. And the disciples said they had just seen Elijah. They had just heard Elijah speak. And they said, well, then why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? And that's still to come in our time. Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, and I have to think that he was a bit wistful when he said this. He said, I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they didn't recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. And so what happened to John was very much on his mind, because from this point on, this is a man facing his death. His disciples don't understand it, but he is. You can see it in the things that he says. But he also makes it very clear that John was the Elijah. But again, John the Baptist, eating locusts, eating wild honey, yelling at people that they had to change. Well, I made up the yelling part. But, he was a very powerful speaker, apparently. And he harangued people and harassed people. And yet they ate it up, and they turned to him, and they did the things that he told. Well, in many cases, some of them, of course, rejected him. But did John turn hearts of the fathers to children? Children to fathers? I'm not sure that he did. But this is going to happen. It's prophesied that it's going to happen. It still has to happen. And I, for one, am happy about that. I love children. I love fathers. I love mothers. I love sisters. I love brothers. I love grandparents, especially at this point. But that's a wonderful thing. If we could restore the family again, we could restore God's kingdom. They're so tied hand in hand, and that inspires me, that we still have to have the hearts of the fathers turned to the children and the children to our fathers. And it makes me, want to support our camp programs, because they're one of the most important things that we do. And they make me want to stand up here and not say things like how bad our youth are. They make me want to say, I love our youth, and the fact that they're struggling every day to live God's way, whether they understand it or not. Amen. I'm all for it. Let's do our part to support them and not harass them. These are difficult times, but I hope the thing that you gather for this, I need to end, because Diane has to get to the airport. Her daughter and grandkids are coming in. But there's great reason for hope. Jesus tells us to pray for specific things in Matthew 24. Like, for instance, we don't want to flee on a winter or on a Sabbath. Do you pray for that? He told us we should. I don't understand why, but he told us we should. And he says in the Lord's Prayer, we should be praying that his kingdom would come. And we do pray that. God is alive, God is at work, and we mourn on the outside, but part of us also rejoices on the inside. It will all work to the glory of God and his kingdom.